So welcome back to On Emergence, the podcast about systems thinking and how we can leverage complexity thinking to help ourselves be better leaders, better managers, better entrepreneurs. Today I want to look at the topic of complexity as competitive advantage with you. How is it that through fully understanding, fully considering the complexity of a situation, we can gain ourselves competitive advantage as leaders? My name is Zoe Zeitler. I'm your host for the show and your resident expert in all matters ESG, conscious leadership, and societal transformation. So, what is our main thesis here? It's that leaders who can hold more nuance will outperform those who can't. I truly believe, both from experience and from research, that paying attention to the subtleties of the dynamics in our team, in operations, or even in the industry as a whole, gives us significant advantage. Gallup has been measuring employee engagement globally for decades. Worldwide, only 23% of employees are actively engaged at work. You've probably seen this number, and you may have tried to solve it, but there's a hidden factor that no statistical report has addressed. It's not a motivation problem. It's not a management problem, it's a systemic problem. Today's topic will reach into this factor and what you can do about it. Because if you're a leader, whether that's running a team, a company, or a transformative program, chances are you're carrying a particular kind of exhaustion. We are told, be innovative, but don't take risks. Be authentic, but stay professional. Be collaborative, but still deliver individual results. If you felt paralyzed, frustrated, or quietly cynical about any of these, that's not a you problem. That's a systemic problem. And the fact that it feels personal is itself part of the system. Here's what's surprising. These contradictions aren't accidental. They're the predictable output of organizations that were designed for a simpler world and never updated for the one we're actually living in. How did we get here? Let's start with how we've been taught to think about leadership and management. Most management education teaches leaders to apply frameworks onto situations. Rules and models that were determined in the literature are meant to be mapped onto a current problem. The instructions are: find the right framework, execute confidently, get results. And this works beautifully for problems that are only complicated. Tax codes, engineering specifications, legal frameworks. These have correct answers that experts can find. Best practices work in these fields, and expertise compounds. But some issues aren't just complicated. Markets aren't just complicated. Teams aren't just complicated. Ecosystems aren't just complicated. They're complex. And that distinction changes everything. A complicated system can be taken apart, understood in pieces, and put back together. The expertise that worked last time will work again. But a complex system, a living system, behaves differently. It responds to being observed. It adapts. It produces outcomes that nobody designed or predicted. The same intervention produces different results in different contexts, and sometimes even produces the opposite result in the same context at a different time. Markets, teams, and organizations are all complex systems that cannot have their problem solved through the same solution each time. They need to be probed, understood holistically, and approached with a different kind of intelligence than the one most of us were trained to deploy. Management education doesn't just fail to teach complexity, it actually actively trains it out of students. The entire architecture of business school rewards the clean answer, the decisive framework, the confident recommendation, and ambiguity is penalized. Nuance is judged as weakness, and the student who says, it depends on 17 interacting factors gets a worse grade than the one who says apply Porter's 5 forces. So we graduate leaders who are extraordinarily skilled at performing certainty in uncertain situations. They've been trained to project confidence precisely when the situation demands curiosity. The crisis isn't ignorance, it's competence stacked in the wrong direction, and the organizational systems around managers reinforce this dynamic. Quarterly reporting demands linear causality, and board presentations reward narrative simplicity. I don't fully understand what's happening yet is career-limiting language in most corporate cultures. The higher someone rises, the more pressure they're under to pretend the system is simpler than it is, and the less feedback they receive that would tell them otherwise. Here's the implication worth sitting with. What if simplicity is a privilege of the powerful? The leaders at the top receive clean narratives because there are layers of people below them absorbing the complexity and translating it upward into digestible form. The leader who thinks they're operating in a simple system is often just well insulated from the complexity their organization is actually navigating, which means the solution isn't better intentions, it's better systems literacy, and that's exactly what we're building today. 5 thinkers have shaped my thinking on this topic more than any others. I want to share the sharpest insight from each one. Together, they build a complete picture of what it actually means to lead a complex system well. Donella Meadows wrote, "The world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system, and we treat it as if it were not." Her most powerful contribution to the literature of systems thinking is the concept of leverage points, places in a system where a small shift produces a large change. And here's what makes this counterintuitive. The most obvious leverage points are usually the weakest. Changing a number, adjusting a rule, reshuffling a budget. These feel impactful, but produce marginal results. The most powerful leverage points are often the most difficult to see. They live at the level of goals of the system, the structure of information flows, and above all, the mindset or paradigm from which the system arises. Many leaders are pulling less than optimal levers with enormous effort, while the real leverage point sits untouched, so nobody can see it. Complexity literacy is what lets you find it. Peter Senge gave us one of the most deceptively simple observations in organizational thinking. Today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. His concept of systems archetypes maps the recurring structural patterns that produce predictable organizational problems. The most relevant one here is what he calls shifting the burden. Your organization has a problem, you apply a symptomatic fix that works fast and feels satisfying. But if it's only a quick fix, it reduces the pressure to address the fundamental solution, which atrophies from disuse. Over time, managers become dependent on the symptomatic fix, and the underlying problem gets worse. Most organizational firefighting is structurally identical to addiction. The more skillfully you fight fires, the more fires you need to fight. The leader who can see this pattern before it's entrenched is operating at a completely different level than one who can't. Dave Snowden developed the Sinefin framework, and his sharpest provocation is this. The major failure of intelligence is the failure to understand that what worked in the past may not work now, and the system has changed. The Sinefin framework distinguishes between complicated and complex systems. Complicated systems, such as an aircraft engine or a tax code, have correct answers that experts can find, and best practices work. Complex systems, such as a market, a culture, or a team under stress, have no right answers, only emergent ones. You can't predict outcomes in complex systems. You can only create conditions and respond to what emerges. The leaders who outperform others aren't necessarily smarter. They've simply stopped applying engineering logic to living systems. They've learned to be comfortable not knowing while still acting. That combination, comfort with uncertainty, paired with decisive action, is one of the rarest and most valuable leadership qualities in complex environments. W. Ross Ashby proved a crucial theory in 1956 that organizations are still ignoring today. He called it the law of requisite variety. Only variety can absorb variety. A system can only regulate its environment to the degree that it contains equivalent internal variety. In organizational terms, that means that a leadership team with a narrow range of thinking styles, backgrounds, or cognitive approaches cannot adequately respond to a complex and varied environment. It will be systematically outmaneuvered by the complexity it can't model internally. Diversity of thought isn't a values statement, it's an engineering requirement. The homogeneous leadership team isn't just ethically questionable, it's actually structurally incapable of navigating complexity. But here's the part that usually gets left out of the diversity conversation. Variety only absorbs variety if it's actually heard. A diverse team whose perspectives are filtered, softened, or ignored before they reach decision maker gives the optics of variety without the structural benefit. Essentially, diversity without psychological safety is just decoration. Our last systems thinker for today, Gregory Bateson, identified the structure of the double bind, a situation where contradictory instructions at different levels make any response simultaneously right and wrong. Be innovative, but don't take risks. Be authentic, but stay professional. Be collaborative, but do deliver individual results. When people in organizations seem confused, paralyzed, or cynical, the instinct is to blame the individual. Bateson would say, look for the double bind embedded in the organizational culture. The contradictory instructions are usually invisible to the people giving them. And you can't resolve a double bind that you can't see. Complexity literacy is what makes it visible. There's one more dimension of complexity that's almost never discussed in leadership contexts, and it might be the most important one. It's the timescale problem. Complex systems operate across multiple timescales simultaneously. Most organizational decision-making is optimized for the shortest one. A decision that looks correct at the quarterly level can be actively destructive at the 5-year level. We're going to look at a case example of Nokia to illustrate this point. Donella Meadows calls this the problem of the long feedback loop. When the consequence of an action is delayed enough, humans systematically fail to connect cause and effect. Climate change is a macro example, and burnout is a micro one. Cultural erosion is a leadership example. Leaders don't feel the cost of suppressing disagreement or rewarding conformity until years later, when an organization has lost its capacity to self-correct. This is not just a cognitive challenge, it's actually a neurological one, because our brains are wired for immediate feedback. So leading complex systems requires building artificial feedback loops that compress timescales, making the long-term consequences of today's decisions visible before they're irreversible. That's not just a mindset shift, that's actually a design challenge. And it's one of the highest leverage things a complexity-literate leader can do. So let's look at a real-life example. Nokia in 2007. At this time, Nokia had the largest mobile market share in the world. They had the best engineers in their industry, and their internal research had already identified the smartphone as the future. They had actually built touchscreen prototypes before the iPhone launched. They had the talent, the resources, the market position, and the foresight. But within 6 years, they'd lost almost everything. So why did Nokia fail? It wasn't because they didn't see the innovation coming. They failed because their system couldn't hear what it already knew. I'm going to apply each of our 5 thinkers from today to explain what happened. Through Senge's lens, today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. Nokia's extraordinary manufacturing efficiency, the solution that had made them dominant in the market, became the constraint that prevented them from moving fast enough. Their hierarchy, the solution that had scaled them globally, became the system that filtered out the signals that they most needed to hear. The very capabilities that built them became the burden that broke them. Through Snowden's Cinefin lens, we would say that leadership applied complicated system thinking to a complex system problem. They looked for the right answer. Which platform, which partnership, which product roadmap to use, when the question was actually about creating conditions for emergence. Apple, on the other hand, ran the probe, sense, respond process. Launch, observe, iterate, launch again. One team was solving an engineering problem. The other was navigating a living system. And the living system approach won. Through Bateson's lens, the double bind was alive in Nokia's culture. Innovation was the corporate value written on the wall and in the annual reports, but protecting the existing business was the actual incentive structure, in bonuses, in promotion criteria. Engineers who raised uncomfortable truths about the smartphone threat were simultaneously correct and career limited for saying so. The contradictory instruction was invisible to the people giving it, so nobody resolved it because the leaders couldn't see it. If we look at Nokia's decline through Ashby's lens, we can see that Nokia's leadership lacked the internal variety to model what was happening in the market. A more cognitively diverse leadership team would have been structurally capable of seeing what a homogeneous one could not. The diversity that might have saved them was systematically filtered out by the hierarchy that was designed to create alignment. And through Meadows' lens, the leverage point wasn't the product roadmap. It wasn't the platform strategy either. It wasn't even the organizational structure. It was the mental model at the top of the organization. The paradigm that said, we understand this market. We have always understood this market, and our job is to execute. That was the belief that needed shifting, and nobody shifted it until it was too late. 5 thinkers, each with their distinct lenses, all pointing at the same failure, and all offering a different entry point for intervention. I want to share something from my own experience here, because I think it makes this more than just theoretical. I've worked in organizations going through frequent shifts in team composition and leadership. Each of these changes made sense on paper. Each one was a reasonable solution to a reasonable problem. But unfortunately, no one was tracking the cumulative effect. Morale was slowly eroding, and decision-making was getting muddier. The people most affected had no language for what was happening to them, because the cause was 6 months and 4 decisions behind the symptoms. When I entered these organizations, I took time, more time than really felt comfortable for me, to understand the dynamics of the team before I said anything. And when I did name it, it was received well, appreciatively even. And then, for the most part, things continued as before. And that's when I understood that complexity literacy isn't just about seeing a pattern. It's about understanding why systems resist the very insights that could help them. The friction usually isn't malicious. It's usually structural. And that's both more frustrating and more interesting than having someone to blame. So what does all this mean practically? Let me pull it together into 4 shifts that complexity-literate leaders make. The first shift is seeing your organization as an ecosystem rather than a machine, as a complex web of elements that influence each other, where understanding the characteristics and typical responses of each element is the key to effective adjustment. The moment you stop asking what's the right answer and start asking what conditions need to exist for the right answer to emerge, your entire leadership practice changes. What you measure changes. What meetings you run changes. What you pay attention to when something goes wrong changes. The second shift is treating adaptability as your primary strategic asset. The way we do things here is either your greatest competitive advantage or your greatest liability, depending entirely on whether the environment has changed. The organizations that survive across the decades aren't necessarily the ones with the best strategy. They're ones that develop genuine metabolic flexibility, that can digest new options. Rigidity, however successful it was yesterday, is organizational debt accumulating interest. The third shift that gives complexity-literate leaders a competitive advantage is treating diversity as infrastructure rather than optics. Ashby proved it mathematically, but diversity only works if it's heard. Diverse perspectives filtered before they reach decision makers give an organization the appearance of variety without the structural benefits. The Nokia engineers knew, but nobody in leadership heard them. Build a psychological safety that allows variety to actually function in the organization's advantage. The fourth complexity-literate shift is the one most likely to make people uncomfortable, but it's the one I think matters most. We should start treating emotions as organizational data. In a mindful, grounded person, emotions are not noise in the system. They're a signal. Anxiety in a team often precedes the data that explains it by weeks or even months. A leader who notices that something feels off in a meeting, in a client relationship, in the energy of the room, and investigates rather than dismisses it, is accessing information that no dashboard will show them for another quarter. The organizations that integrate emotional intelligence into their symptomatic diagnoses aren't being too soft. They're expanding their data sources. They're running more feedback loops. They're making their organizations more resilient. The question isn't whether your organization is a complex system. It is. The question is whether you're leading it like one. Every framework you've been given, every matrix, every model, every best practice was built by someone who encountered complexity and tried to make it manageable. That impulse is completely understandable, and it can be useful at times. But the map is not the territory, and the territory keeps changing. The leaders who will outperform in the next decade aren't the ones with the best answers. They're the ones who've developed a tolerance, even an appetite, for not knowing yet. They're the ones who treat confusion as the beginning of understanding, rather than a problem to be resolved as quickly as possible. The high-performance leader will be the ones who have enough internal variety to see what's actually in front of them, rather than what their mental model predicts should be there. Complexity is not the enemy of good leadership. It's the invitation to better leadership. And I'll leave you with a reframing of the question we started with. The 23% engagement figure It's not a verdict on the individuals. It's a signal from your system. The question is whether you're ready to hear it and to go deep enough to find out what it's actually saying. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of On Emergence. In our next episode, we're going to explore the roles of translators and bridge builders in organizations, which I argue are often invisible but crucial roles that aren't written into any job description. Until then.